March of last year, my roommate and I at college decided to go camping at a place just above our college in eastern Kentucky one day. We had got up there and unpacked our tent and soon realized that we had forgotten the poles. I know, stupid. So we pack up and start to head down the mountain. At this time it's about to storm, around 9 p.m., and it's dead silent in the woods. My friend had fallen and hurt his knee, so I grabbed some of the gear he brought too and called for a buddy to meet us at the bottom of the mountain. A side note is that we had usually whistled to each other while hiking because it's easier than shouting. Anyways, I hear this particular whistle, which is a unique one, sort of like the one from Assassin's Creed, coming from down the mountain. Assuming it was our other friend waiting at the bottom for us, I whistled back until he calls us and asks if we were whistling at him. We tell him, "No, I just whistled back at you." And he tells me he had heard 2 distinct whistles. Then I hear the same whistle again, coming from behind me up the mountain. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later on, I realized I smelled ozone around the mountain, and when I described this to my fiancée, she was getting chills, and she told me about the goat man of Appalachia that supposedly smells like ozone and mimics its potential victims. I'm not sure what it was, but I am for darn sure it wasn't a bird. A little over a year ago, I spent the summer backpacking Southeast Asia. For reference, I am a college-age female and most of my traveling was done solo. About 3 weeks into my trip, I was in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where I stayed for a few days before heading further into the mountains. I had joined up with an organization group at that point, which had pre-booked the hotel we were staying in. That afternoon, I went to go drop off my backpack in my room, where I was staying alone, and the minute I walked in, something felt very, very wrong. It's a feeling I don't even know how to describe. I immediately felt like I was being watched, and I made a point to put my head down and avoid looking in the mirrors that were in the room out of fear of seeing something or someone watching me. As time went on, I realized that the more time I spent in the room, the worse it would affect my thoughts and emotions. That night I kept seeing a vision of a woman dressed in all white with black hair covering her face standing in my room. I didn't even close my eyes while I was showering out of fear of her standing there when I opened my eyes. I could have sworn I wasn't alone in the room and that the other presence was definitely malicious. Also that night, I was walking back out of the bathroom and glanced at the glass bottle of water that was set out. A whole scenario played out in my head of me breaking the glass water bottle on the table and using it to slit open both my wrists. I'm sorry for the gruesome details, but keep in mind that I have never had any thoughts like this, so I was extremely distressed and scared. The next morning, I got up early and left my hotel room to do some sightseeing. About an hour in, I felt extremely nauseous and lightheaded. Afraid I was going to pass out alone on a street, I went back to my hotel and laid down to get some rest. As soon as I went back into my hotel room, an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. I got the idea in my head that I was going to die that day. Everything in my mind was telling me that once I closed my eyes, I would never wake up again. I kept telling myself that I was probably just sick or dehydrated, so I kept drinking water and telling myself I was going to be okay. I was still awake, but I just shut my eyes and immediately I had a vision that demons were grasping onto my ankles and trying to pull me into hell. In that moment, I was praying and screaming in my head for God to save me. In my vision, He grabbed my hands and pulled me up, and then I passed out for several hours. I immediately left my hotel room when I woke up and felt fine, but that night when I came back, I was having the same vision of the woman and feeling like I wasn't alone. We left the next morning and nothing remotely similar has ever happened to me since, but I've always been left wondering what that experience could have meant or been. Also, we stayed in that hotel one more night a week later. I was in a different room, and it was completely normal. It should be noted that before heading on this trip, I was prescribed some malaria medication. I don't remember the exact brand, but I do remember checking the side effects for this particular one, and hallucinations weren't a common side effect, even though I know that several of them do cause them. However, I took it every day that I was gone, but never had any problems anywhere else besides that hotel room, so it's hard for me to believe that it would cause me such intense hallucinations only in that place and nowhere else in my whole trip. Also, I'm not sure if this is relevant, but it should still be noted that it was an old hotel built around the ruins of the old city wall. Any and all thoughts and opinions are welcome. I'm genuinely curious what you have to say and what you think. Ever since my younger sister was a child, she's spoken about being sensitive to things. When she was really young, around 4 or 5, she spoke about the fireworks lady. No one knew who she was, but she said she'd see her around often. She was in bed one night trying to go to sleep. She eventually did, but was awoken to what sounded like a group of people having a conversation, chit-chattering to each other. She turned around to face her room from the wall and saw a group of what she could only describe as little miniature-looking goblins standing in the middle of her room. When she made eye contact with them, they whispered, "She's seen us." Then she immediately passed out. It could have been sleep paralysis, but she's adamant she was awake because she could move. I told her about brownies, a certain type of fae that live in people's houses that don't like to be seen, and they look a lot like goblins. A fae being a humanoid mystical creature that wields great magical power in magic and elementals, and they usually have antennae and insect-like wings, sort of like fairies. Another incident was the time she was staying at her friend's house. 3 of them were in bed trying to fall asleep when they all saw a dark shadow of a man wearing a hat in the corner of the room. He was bopping his head up and down apparently. The 2 friends freaked out, but my sister told them to calm down and that if you ignore him, he'll go away. A blue light that looked like a sphere of moving water then flowed down from the ceiling that she said was good energy protecting them. 3 people all say they saw the same thing and definitely were not asleep. My sister puts it down to the fact that my friend's mom is a drug addict and her room was the one that this happened in. The room had a horrid energy to it. She assumed the Hat Man was a manifestation of this bad energy. But 2 weeks later, she saw the same black shadow Hat Man this time in our house. Is it possible that it followed her from her friend's house? I told her that the Hat Man had been seen by quite a few different people, and she's still trying to wrap her head around it. So this happened about a year ago. I was working at my friend's property in North California. Full disclosure, it was a marijuana farm, which kind of feeds into the rest of the story. And I was sleeping in my pickup truck's covered bed each night, which was about a 1/4 mile walk down the gravel drive each night. One night I turned in for sleep, and sometime later I was awoken by the sound of something scratching up against the side of my truck. I had a bunch of dog and human food in the cab, so I figured it was some kind of animal trying to get at the food. I was laying there awake in the bed for about 30 seconds trying to decide if I should try to scare whatever critter it was, or just ignore it, when the scratching stops abruptly, followed maybe 2 seconds later by very pronounced rhythmic knocking on my windshield, as if someone were trying to wake me up. I immediately grab my mag light, which I had next to me, shoot it up and shine the light out the window, and there's nothing there. And it's dead quiet out, and I don't hear any sounds of anything running through the brush at all. As this is all happening, I notice that my dog is dead asleep, and this was the first thing that really concerned me. I take her out camping a lot, and she is always on alert to anything that comes around the vicinity, usually waking up with warning growls. I had to shake her awake. What happens next is basically nothing, but this is also a bit odd to me now in hindsight. I fell asleep immediately and very calmly. I'm a bit of a high-strung person, and normally if I ever hear a squirrel rummaging around camp at night, I'll be wide awake for a good while with a high heart rate, but this time I fall into a deep sleep. I do, however, remember the dream which followed very well. It was a bit abstract, but I was in a place resembling my hometown, and I was aware of a group of 3 people hunting for me. I could see them, but they weren't able to see me. There wasn't much substance to the dream, but it left a very palpable feeling of dread and panic. I wake up the next day only to find out first thing in the morning that a friend of the property owner's who was in the local government had tipped him off to the fact that warrants had been served on the property, and we had about 48 hours to get whatever done that we could, basically removing as much product from the property as possible. as well as firearms and cash. I also discovered that my truck was completely dead, would not turn over at all, after having been running great with no signs of any malfunction for months. So, long story short, we do what we can in the 48 hours allotted, and I get a friend I was working with to give me and the dog a ride out of the area. We were about to vacate the property at around midnight, and I realized there's a few things that I had left in my truck, so I head back down the drive to get them. I get about 20 feet away from the truck, and my dog sits down in the middle of the trail and won't come any closer. I call out to her and try to cajole her along, but she won't budge. I head closer to the truck, and right when I get within about a foot of the door, the truck starts violently shaking back and forth in place. I've got the light trained on it, the windows are all up, there's nothing inside running around the cab, it's just shaking violently on its own. I turn tail and leave, figuring I'll get a new passport one of these days. We leave the property, and as we're driving out of Northern California, I'm telling the story to my friend. I think I was probably a bit incoherent and crazy sounding at the time, because it really messed with my head when it happened. He was camped on a ridge overlooking my truck, and he says to me that on the same night, he had been awoken at a late hour as well and had gotten out of the tent to take a pee. It was pretty bright with the moon and the stars and whatnot, but he says that when he looked down at the ridge towards my truck, he couldn't see anything. The whole area had no light penetrating it, as if some kind of shade blocked out everything around the trail. One more important detail I forgot to mention to the story, and this was the thing that really made me lose it. The day before this happened, I had gotten a message on Facebook from a friend back home whom I hadn't talked to in a few years out of the blue. It basically read something like, "Hey man, this is kind of weird, but I had a really messed up dream about you last night, and it was bad enough I felt like I had to check in on you." I replied to him saying I was all good. The next morning, after the weird knocks and dreams, I get back on the internet and find a message from my uncle, who I haven't really been in steady contact with, saying, almost word for word, the exact same thing. This part really freaked me out. It's been about a year and nothing else much has come of it. The truck's still up on that mountain, too far and undeveloped to get towed. I had one other crazy occurrence recently while camping in the woods in Kentucky, but I don't really think they're related, and this one just made much more of an impression on me. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Ever since my grandpa died, which was back in 2004, the same type of bird had been often following us in places where he lived or liked to be. I'm no expert in birds, but it's always this pretty small gray bird with orange breast. When it appears, it just looks curiously like it's just observing. It would come quite close to us. It would never be scared, but would never eat the breadcrumbs or anything we put next to it. Most times we see it around his grave in the cemetery, but not always. Sometimes it appears after rethinking memories of my grandfather. Just yesterday, my mom and grandma were walking through the forest and picking up edible berries and mushrooms like many people would do. Suddenly the same bird was next to us, observed us for a moment, and flew away. Then my mom tells me that she had just thought about Grandpa and how being in the forest was one of his favorite activities after he retired. Just a cool thing that's been happening to us. Has anybody else had a similar experience? I've only had a few experiences that would qualify as paranormal until tonight. I've been home all day alone with my dog watching football. I live with my parents, but they've been gone all day working on a house they recently bought. 2 hours ago, I left my house to go wash my truck at the nearest car wash. Shortly after, and one clean truck later, I returned home. Upon doing so, I came inside, took my dog out, let him back in shortly after, and gave him a treat. The dog runs off, and I begin washing the dishes. The only dog we have now is a year-old Boston Terrier. Our boxer recently passed away, leaving us with only the one. Being a young dog, he has a lot of energy and very often goes to the bonus room right above the kitchen to run figure eights around the couches until he's tired. So there I stood washing dishes, and I hear him start his circuit running upstairs. Man, he was wide open, and it went on for about 5 minutes before he instantly stopped. As I mentioned before, I was in the kitchen, and my parents' bed is visible from the kitchen sink where I stood. Right as he stopped running, I just happened to look into their room, and what do I see? My only dog on the bed, asleep. I instantly froze. It felt like the gears in my brain were screeching to a halt as I stood trying to figure out what I had just heard or how he got back down there so fast without me noticing. After standing at the sink confused for longer than I would like to admit, I finished the dishes and go to the laundry room to tend to my clothes. The laundry room is between my parents' bedroom and the stairs going to the bonus room. I stood folding clothes when I see my dog, now awake, walking slowly by the door towards the stairs with his head inches from the ground. Again I froze, hoping what was about to happen wasn't going to happen. But it did. I hear it. My dog begins growling quietly and deeply. I peek my head out of the laundry room and he is at the foot of the stairs, staring towards the top, hair on his neck straight up, steadily growling. This was all I wanted. I'm not afraid to admit it. It freaked me out and I've heard way too many stories here to even think about going upstairs. As if this wasn't enough, I call my dog and have him follow me back into my living room to sit on the couch. As I am sitting on the couch trying to play it cool while my mind runs 99 miles per hour, I look out the living room window across the back porch to my bedroom window and see something flash across the window. I thought that's enough. Someone or something is in my house. I had considered this before, but this was the first evidence I physically saw. So I jumped up and ran to my bedroom. Nothing. No one's there. Nothing's moving. With this, I decide, okay, I'm grabbing the dog and I'm leaving until my parents get home and we can clear the house together. I sit down on the edge of my bed to put my shoes back on, and I hear something slam against the wood floor on the other side of the house, and I about jump out of my skin. That's all it took. I sprinted to the living room, picked up my dog, and ran out the front door to my truck and drove to the nearest gas station, where I called my parents and now wait on them to meet me at the house. I figured in the meantime I would share this story, which is the first one I've ever experienced that I felt is worth sharing. I am nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof about going back, even with my parents. Now this is a quick story, but I was lying in my bed about 10 minutes ago watching football and eating popcorn. All of a sudden my head felt violently pushed down and my body folded in half. My vision started spinning and twisting like I was falling and lasted for about 8 to 10 seconds. I'm not a small guy and the physical and emotional feelings are crazy. My neck is stiff, I have a headache, and I feel very angry. I've heard of spiritual attacks before, but does anyone know what just happened to me? I live in Australia. I remember coming home one time from holiday when I was 12 or under, and my nan told me of a startling experience she had while I was away. Curiosity getting the better of me, I asked if she had any more, and she was all happy to oblige. I didn't sleep that night. These experiences all take place at a house I used to live in from when I was born in the early 90s to when we moved in 2002. This house was a very special house. It was simultaneously my favorite and most feared place in the world, and you're about to find out why. To make a brief description, it was an old house. It was fairly big, on 5 acres of land, in a fairly populated suburb, but also full of forest and bush, sitting at the foot of the Blue Mountains, an hour west of Sydney. We had our land, and behind us was a sort of government-owned forest land that was 100 or 200 acres, and the council gave 0 Fs about people doing their stuff there. Hopefully that will give you a better picture of the stories I'm about to tell. I'll start with the story my nan told me first, which really stood out to me, and finish on the ones that perhaps are the creepiest. I talked to my nan and my mother not too long ago to confirm the details. Strap yourselves in. This will be a bit long, but hopefully worth it. The first story happened when I was visiting my grandfather and grandparents interstate. My nan was home alone in this house doing the ironing when she saw a little boy walk into my room. Surprised to see that I'm home, she walked into my bedroom to see what was going on there. She stopped immediately as she walked in, because it wasn't me sitting on my bed, but a boy that looked remarkably like me, but off somehow. Not in an evil or twisted way or anything, but she knew he was different to living beings like us. They stared at each other for what seemed like minutes, and not knowing what to do, she tried to be as passive as possible. She said, "I'm sorry, little one, but we're moving soon. You can come with us, though." He didn't respond, but after a few moments of silence, he stood up and ran straight for the door and threw her. She didn't see the boy again, but when she told Mum, my mother immediately had a massive spat at her. "You should never invite things like that into your home," she said, "even if seemingly innocent." The second story was when my nan was much younger and my mother and uncle were children. My nan was hanging up washings on the line, and when she heard a strange humming noise she had never heard in her life before. She was startled, so she started calling for her children. She walked to the other end of the yard and looked up and saw that my mother and uncle were staring at her. Hovering and descending slowly to the ground was some sort of flying saucer made of something metallic and silver, and it was rotating. It came down to a couple of feet off the ground, humming still and all, and left a gigantic circular burn mark in the paddock. It left after a few minutes, ascending higher into the sky, and whooshed off into the distance once it seemed like a safe height. The horses were mental for days. The third story, which may have something to do with aliens or UFOs, was told to me by my mother. She told me that one night when she was sleeping a few years before I was born, she suddenly woke up to lights flashing all around her. She was freaked out, but that was only the beginning. She was suddenly aware that there was someone on top of her. Still in her fugue state, as we all are sometimes after waking, she went to cuddle who she thought was her boyfriend at the time. The dimensions weren't right though, and she then realized it wasn't her boyfriend, but some man-like creature, but all parts of the body disproportioned. Bigger head, eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Bigger hands, bigger torso, and it was all funky looking. She tried to scream but couldn't, and somehow sensing things weren't going as planned, this thing seemed to be penetrating her somehow, not sexually, but in a sort of supernatural force. She told me as I talked to her on the phone that she had been assaulted somehow. Although not sexually, she felt like the thing was stealing her eggs or something. I would like to note that my mom has never been hysterical about sexual assault and that was the first I heard of that story, so she wouldn't be making it up for sympathy. Once it had what it came for, it disappeared. She ran into my nan's room, still unable to scream for a while, and cried herself to sleep while my nan consoled her. She didn't much like that room after that. The fourth story is my mom again, and I'll try to keep this one short. Me and my little cousin were very young, both under ages of 6 and 7, and were taking a bath. We seemed all right, and Mom went to check on some things for a couple of moments. Next thing I remember, my little cousin was completely underwater, and it felt like a while. I didn't do anything though because I was young. It wasn't really clicking in my head that she was in trouble. I guess I must have thought she knew what she was doing. Next thing, before even a minute went by, my mom rushed into the room, picked her up, dried her, and cuddled her. I asked her when I was older what that was about, and she told me that she heard a woman screaming from the bathroom her name. There was no one in there but me and my cousin, and my cousin's head being underwater, me being a boy, and me not hearing anything. Maybe something was protecting us, and that's what I like to think, anyway. The last story is the creepy one like I mentioned. I mentioned earlier that there was a council forested area out of the back of our place. I used to be an adventurer. I surely would have been a Captain Cook's ship if I were alive at that time, and I would be there for hours a day without there ever being any sort of trouble. One time, though, makes my hair stand up on my neck thinking about it. Me and my family and friends were looking for a horse that had somehow gotten past the barbed wire fence separating our house from council lands. My mom said I could run riot because I always did, and maybe I could find the horse. I had been separated from them for maybe a half an hour, and I came across this abandoned 19th century settler house in this land. It could be better described as a ruin though. No roof, 3 walls, 2 rooms. And right next to it was a pit that went down into complete darkness. Although I don't think it was too deep, maybe 20 feet, it was covered with logs to stop the horses from falling in. As I was doing my thing around this ruin, I heard someone calling my name. Kay. I thought it was my mom until I realized it was coming from the pit. I wouldn't last in a horror movie though, because I freaking started approaching it. All of a sudden, when I was maybe 20 feet away, still hearing this thing calling my name, I heard my mom calling behind me and running over to me. She pulled me away from there and told me not to go near there again. I asked her why, and she told me years later that she said so because she heard what was calling my name, too. So I just wanted to write this out. It's around 5:30 a.m. I went to bed about 15 minutes prior, so I'm still not fully asleep. I could still hear CNN in the background on my television. Then I feel and see a huge black force sprint to me from about 10 feet away. Instantly I screamed so loud twice and run out of the room. It was so scary I didn't have time to think. What was that? I screamed so fast it seemed like it wasn't even me that shouted. How it felt. Imagine closing your eyes and someone just sprints at you like on their tippy toes quietly. You still know it happened, but it's quiet. It felt so violent and angry, that force that ran through me. I have no idea what it was, and any answers are more than welcome. Several months ago, I booked an appointment with a notorious psychic who claims to communicate with dead loved ones. The guy had such a good reputation that I had to wait almost 5 months to see him, and I booked him because I wanted to speak with my father. Now, the guy kept telling me about things only me and my parents know. Sometimes he was going as far as sharing the names of people around us and describing their personalities or events that unfolded while my father was still alive. He even described how my father died. I didn't say a word about it, and told me how many people were involved in the car crash that killed him. Then he told me about a night in particular around a year ago. That night I felt a heavy weight just by my legs. I thought it was my cat because it kind of felt like the weight of a cat sleeping by your side on a bed, but it also felt way heavier than a cat, and when I looked, the cat was not here and the weight just kind of magically lifted. Also, the door to my room was closed, which confirmed it couldn't have been the cat. The psychic confirmed it was my father saying hello, which is what I always thought it was. That in itself was mind-blowing enough, but the day after I couldn't believe what my mom told me. She called me in the AM. She sounded weird. I thought she was about to reveal someone had died or something, but then I realized she was just hesitant to reveal what had happened to her. She told me that during the night she was awakened by kisses. Now I swear my mom is a completely sane individual, and also she never wakes up during the night. Like she could live by an international airport, and I swear she would be sound asleep for 8 solid hours every night. So the night after my visit to the psychic at around 3 a.m., she woke up to someone kissing on her lips, except that she was absolutely alone. She was really disturbed by it and tried to tell herself that it was just a dream, but she was telling me that she knows deep down that she really felt those kisses and that they felt slightly wet, like actual kisses from an actual living person. Yeah, the wet thing kind of grossed me out too. I know it was my dad kissing my mom in her sleep, and I think it's the most mind-blowing and romantic and funny thing I've ever been told. So it almost seems like love even extends into the afterlife. Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. If you wish to support the channel further and get MP3 downloads of all these amazing narrations, ad-free and 24 hours before everyone else, please consider supporting me on Patreon for $1 or more a month. And also check out the Spreadshirt merch store when you get a chance. Hope everyone's having a fabulous week, and I'll see you again soon.